August 15th, 1945. The sun hung heavy over Tokyo, but the city lay in silence. Rubble still smoldered from raids that had reduced entire districts to ashes. Once proud avenues were lined with hollowed-out buildings, their steel frames standing like blackened skeletons against the sky. Survivors picked through ruins, searching for food, for water, for something that still resembled life. Then, in the stillness, a sound broke through, soft at first, almost unnoticeable. It was not the wail of an air raid siren, not the drone of engines overhead, not the whistle of falling bombs. It was music, American music, a brass section bright and confident, a swing rhythm that carried a strange, foreign cheer. To ears accustomed only to military marches and the cries of warning, it was otherworldly. Civilians froze. They looked to the sky, to the broken rooftops, to the battered streets, wondering if this was real or another cruel trick of war that in alleyways and courtyards. Men and women leaned in closer, straining to catch the tune. It was Glenn Miller, the swing of a trombone sliding effortlessly into a saxophone's reply, an unmistakable melody carried by loudspeakers the Americans had erected in occupied districts. For the first time in years, sound was not a weapon but a wave of rhythm. For those who had lived through the hunger and fire, it was shocking, an invasion of joy into a land where grief still weighed like lead. An old man in a tattered kimono whispered to himself that he had not heard such carefree music since before the war. A child, barefoot, tilted her head at the strange sound, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Mothers clutched infants tighter, unsure whether this strange noise heralded a new cruelty or a merciful end. The war had not ended with ceremony for these civilians. It ended with the crackling voice of Emperor Hirohito, broadcast days earlier, speaking words they had never heard before: surrender. For most, his voice was distorted, faint, and difficult to comprehend. But the meaning was undeniable. The Empire of Japan had yielded. Now, as American forces marched into their shattered cities, their arrival was not only in boots and jeeps but also in melody. Radios and speakers brought in a world that felt impossibly far away. The triumphant brass, the syncopated drums, the swing of voices captured on record. These were the sounds of a nation untouched by the firestorms that had consumed Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. It was as if another planet had intruded on the ruins of theirs. The first time the records played, silence fell across neighborhoods. Civilians, weary and gaunt, stared at the loudspeakers as though expecting orders or threats. But instead, the rhythm picked up. Trumpets soared. The bass was plucked with confidence. The lyrics, foreign, incomprehensible, rode on waves of joy that needed no translation. Young men who had once drilled with bamboo spears to repel an invasion now found themselves tapping their feet unconsciously. Women who had buried loved ones under rubble tilted their heads, bewildered by the strangeness of it. Could the conqueror's voice carry not commands, not threats, but music? It was unthinkable. And yet, it was happening in their very streets. The shock of it ran deeper than melody. For a society long trained to see America as a faceless enemy, a monstrous power that rained destruction from the skies, the sudden arrival of swing music was more than dissonance. It was disarmament of the spirit. Propaganda had painted Americans as barbaric and merciless. Yet here was proof of something else, a culture of rhythm, laughter, and life. The sheer cheerfulness of the music stood in violent contrast to the reality of defeat. Where Japanese ears expected solemn marches or the drone of official decrees, they now heard trumpets that seemed to mock despair itself. Some wept at the sound, not out of joy, but out of confusion. Could it be possible that war was truly over? Could it be possible that this, of all things, was peace? The sudden eruption of music where only silence and mourning had lived? An old woman, her face lined with years of hardship, pressed her hands together and bowed her head, muttering prayers as if to ward off the spell of this foreign noise. But around her, children began to laugh. They laughed because they did not know the words, but they knew the rhythm. They danced, small feet slapping against broken pavement, moving instinctively to a beat older than borders in American headquarters. This was no accident. It was deliberate. Generators powered the speakers. Soldiers strung wires through streets still littered with rubble. Radios blared not military orders, but broadcasts from across the Pacific. It was psychological as much as political. The occupation was to be not only an assertion of military dominance, but also a reshaping of spirit. And what better way to break the silence of surrender than to fill it with the confidence of swing, the sound of victory reimagined as music? For American soldiers who had marched into cities expecting hatred in every glance, the sight of children giggling at the rhythm was a strange reassurance. Perhaps, through music, the ice of defeat could be melted into something resembling coexistence. The Japanese listened in awe and suspicion. To them, the music was alien, indulgent, and even decadent. Yet it was irresistible. Even as hunger gnawed, even as grief hung heavy, the melodies carried something intangible, hope, or at least distraction. Civilians began to gather where the music played loudest, hesitant at first, then more boldly. Crowds formed in broken streets, not to riot, not to protest, but to listen. Some clapped softly. Others simply closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them like a wave from another world. For a nation that had lived through the drumbeat of militarism, the swing of American jazz was like a message from the future. Unimaginable, unstoppable, undeniable. Night fell, and still the music lingered. Through shattered windows, through half-destroyed homes, through the skeletons of once mighty buildings, the notes carried on. The war had ended not in triumph for these people, but in ash. Yet the strange gift of the occupiers, music, brought with it a realization. Life, however scarred, would continue. In the midst of defeat, in the very shadow of surrender, the streets of Japan had been filled with sound again. And for the first time in years, it was not the sound of war. By the summer of 1945, Japan stood on the edge of collapse. The empire that had once stretched across vast reaches of Asia and the Pacific was crumbling. Cities were gutted, their skylines erased by American bombers. Nearly every major urban center had endured nights where the sky glowed red and ash fell like snow. The economy had disintegrated under blockade, with rice rationed in spoonfuls and coal scavenged from ruins. For civilians, survival had become the only strategy left. And then, with 2 atomic detonations and the weight of Allied pressure, surrender was declared. What came next was not just the military occupation of a nation, but the sudden collision of 2 worlds, an industrial titan of modernity and rhythm stepping into the shattered silence of a broken empire. To understand the shock of that moment, one must first grasp the doctrine that had defined Japan's war years. Isolation, sacrifice, and uniformity were the cornerstones of life. The radio, tightly controlled by the state, transmitted only what the imperial government deemed fit: military updates, propaganda, and speeches that reinforced duty above all else. Entertainment, when permitted, was nationalist in tone: marches, patriotic songs, and operatic broadcasts reminding citizens of their role as tools of the emperor's war machine. The soundscape of daily life was rigid, somber, and always in service of war. For many, the last memory of public sound before the surrender had been the droning wail of air raid sirens, followed by the shriek of descending bombs. When the emperor's voice reached the people on August 15th, it was through a recording broadcast by radio. His words, laden with archaic court language, were difficult to understand. But one truth could not be misinterpreted: Japan had surrendered. For the first time in centuries, the nation would be occupied by a foreign power. Families huddled in ruined homes, listening in silence as the foundation of their world crumbled. For soldiers returning from the front, the news was not just defeat, it was disorientation. Their sacrifice had been for nothing. For civilians, it was both relief and terror. The air raids had stopped, but what would come next? The occupiers were an unknown force, their power undeniable, their culture a mystery. Into this vacuum of silence and uncertainty marched the Americans. They came not only with weapons and vehicles, but also with an overwhelming sense of abundance. Their uniforms were crisp, their supplies plentiful, and their radios alive with sound. To Japanese eyes, weary from years of scarcity, the Americans seemed like beings from another world, unshaken by defeat, carrying with them not just food and fuel, but music. In a land where silence had become the norm, where voices carried only grief or orders, The introduction of swing and jazz was a thunderclap of unfamiliar vitality. Strategically, the Americans understood the necessity of shaping perceptions quickly. General Douglas MacArthur, who established his headquarters in Tokyo's Daiichi Building, envisioned not only political restructuring but also psychological transformation. The occupation was to be more than a military presence. It was to be a reorientation of Japan toward democracy, modernity, and cooperation. And in this effort, culture became a weapon as potent as any rifle. Radios that had once carried only the emperor's decrees now crackled with foreign melodies. Streets that had echoed with marching boots now pulsed with brass and drums. For the conquerors, music was a bridge, a way to demonstrate confidence and vitality. For the conquered, it was bewilderment, fascination, and the first taste of a world they had been told was monstrous. The clash was profound. Japanese civilians had grown up under a system that treated joy as indulgence and individuality as dangerous. Swing music was the embodiment of the opposite: improvisation, rhythm, and freedom. Its very structure defied the rigidity of wartime life. To older generations, it was incomprehensible, even threatening. To younger listeners, it was intoxicating. For those who had been children when the war began, now stepping into adolescence in the ruins, the foreign melodies sparked curiosity rather than fear. It was the sound of something they had never known: modernity without militarism, energy without oppression. Reports from the time capture the strange mix of awe and suspicion. Civilians noted that the Americans, despite being conquerors, laughed openly, sang, and carried music wherever they went. Soldiers would play records from jeeps parked in rubble-strewn neighborhoods, their speakers blasting tunes that turned heads. Some Japanese, still wary, regarded it as a humiliation, a sonic reminder of defeat. Others, quietly, found themselves drawn in. After years of silence broken only by violence, the simple act of hearing music in the streets carried an almost mystical quality. It was as if life itself had returned, alien but undeniable. The broader context of this cultural invasion was equally dramatic. Across Europe, American forces had already spread their music as part of their presence, with swing and jazz becoming symbolic of liberation. Now, in Asia, the same melodies carried a different meaning: not liberation, but occupation. Yet in both cases, the impact was transformative. For the Japanese, who had been told that Americans were demons, the music forced a re-examination. Demons did not bring rhythm and laughter. Demons did not fill streets with melodies that made children dance. The very sound of swing undercut the propaganda of years, reshaping perceptions not with words, but with melody. And so, as the autumn of 1945 settled over Japan, the historical context crystallized. This was not just the defeat of a nation. It was the collision of two cultures at their rawest. On one side, a society battered into silence by war, conditioned to obedience and solemnity. On the other, a victorious power radiating confidence, filling silence with sound, using music as a declaration of both triumph and generosity. The Americans did not need to explain themselves with speeches. The blare of a saxophone said more than any pamphlet could. The occupation had begun not just with boots on the ground, but with songs in the air. For the civilians who lived through it, the shock of those early days remains etched in memory. To walk through ruins and hear, for the first time, the sound of swing was to step into a different era altogether. The world had ended, and a new one had begun. The silence of surrender was broken not by commands, but by music. And in that music lay the seeds of transformation, confusing, disorienting, yet unforgettable. The war was over, but the sound of peace was not silence. It was the rhythm of a foreign land echoing through the streets of Japan. The secret was not in the rifles, nor in the rations, nor even in the devastating atomic bombs that had forced Japan's surrender. It was in something far less tangible, yet infinitely more powerful: the ability to command the air not only with bombers but also with sound. The Americans understood the art of morale, the power offered them, and the quiet domination of culture. What bewildered Japanese civilians most in those first weeks of occupation was not the sight of tanks in their streets, but the strange, buoyant music that poured from radios and speakers. As though the conquerors were less concerned with discipline and more with joy. For the defeated, this was incomprehensible. For the occupiers, it was strategy. The hidden advantage was cultural weaponry, and at its core was American music, jazz, swing, blues, and the big band sound. Unlike the rigid marches of the Japanese Imperial Army, these songs carried improvisation, individuality, and freedom. Every trumpet blast was an assertion that this war had not crushed America's spirit. Every saxophone riff was proof that the victors carried abundance, creativity, and life itself into the streets of Japan. The civilians, conditioned by years of propaganda that painted Americans as monsters, were now confronted by something that seemed utterly alien. An enemy whose greatest weapon after surrender was a melody that made feet tap and hearts quickened to Japanese ears. This music was more than foreign. It was revolutionary. For years, sound had meant control. Loudspeakers barked orders, sirens warned of raids, and broadcasts reinforced obedience. There was no room for improvisation, no tolerance for noise that was not sanctioned by the state. The sudden eruption of swing in the streets shattered that pattern. It was an invasion not of soldiers, but of spontaneity. What left so many civilians stunned was not just the novelty of hearing American music. It was the realization that sound could mean something other than commands or warnings. It could mean joy. It could mean defiance against silence. The Germans had once spoken with grudging admiration of America's cultural depth, even amid war. Nazi officials were bewildered that soldiers on the front carried jazz records into battle zones, playing them in foxholes between firefights. To them, it was undisciplined and chaotic. To the Americans, it was sustenance. Now, in the ruins of Tokyo and Yokohama, that same sustenance was being unleashed as part of a new kind of conquest. American psychological operations had studied the value of music during the war, broadcasting swing and blues across Europe to counter Axis propaganda. In Japan, the tactic was refined further, not merely to weaken the enemy, but to begin reshaping them. For civilians raised under an authoritarian regime, the contrast was staggering. The empire had taught them that music was a tool of the state, a servant to military power. Every note reinforced unity, sacrifice, and duty. American music, by contrast, reveled in individuality. A trumpet could break free, a saxophone could answer, and a drummer could bend rhythm itself. To hear this was to encounter a freedom that had been unimaginable. The hidden advantage was not just that Americans brought food and fuel, it was that they brought a soundscape that hinted at another kind of life. One defined not by obedience, but by choice. The frustration this caused among remnants of the Japanese elite was palpable. Former officers, stripped of command, muttered that the occupiers had found a subtler way to dominate. They had not only disarmed the Japanese military, they were disarming Japanese culture. Civilians who had once marched and stepped to patriotic anthems were now swaying, unconsciously, to foreign rhythms. And there was no countermeasure. How could a government that no longer existed compete with a melody that seemed to dissolve grief, if only for a moment? American records, pressed in the millions back home, now became as powerful as rifles. Armed Forces radio service flooded the airwaves with programs that mixed news, comedy, and above all, music. Jazz greats like Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and Benny Goodman played across the Pacific, their performances recorded in studios far from the devastation of war. For Japanese civilians, it was as though a different universe had cracked open. Here was proof that across the ocean lay a land untouched by starvation, where sound itself was abundant, rich, and fearless. The hidden advantage, then, was twofold. First, it was psychological dominance, the ability to reshape perception not with speeches, but with sound. Second, it was cultural infiltration. Every note was a reminder that America did not only win militarily, it won spiritually. The music carried confidence, self-assurance, and vitality. Where Japan had exhausted itself in sacrifice, America seemed inexhaustible, overflowing with energy that spilled into occupied streets without effort. Civilians could not ignore it. They could not escape it. They could only listen, and in listening, they began to change. Some younger Japanese whispered in awe about the records they heard, describing them as voices from another world. Others tried to mimic the rhythms, drumming on tabletops or humming melodies they barely understood. Older generations shook their heads, calling it decadent and dangerous. But even they could not deny its pull. For a nation that had lost everything, the sound of abundance was irresistible. It was as if the Americans had arrived not only to rebuild the nation's infrastructure, but also to rebuild its very spirit, brick by brick, note by note. What the Germans had once failed to grasp was now being demonstrated before Japanese eyes. America's greatest strength was not just its factories or armies, but its ability to project a culture of vitality. Civilians who had once looked to the emperor for solemn guidance now found themselves listening, almost involuntarily, to the swing of Glenn Miller or the croon of Bing Crosby. This was not surrender, it was seduction, and in its subtlety lay its power. The hidden advantage was this. While Japan had armed its people with silence, America armed its people with song. And in the streets of defeated cities, that difference was impossible to ignore. The conquerors had brought more than victory. They had brought rhythm. And rhythm, unlike rifles, could not be confiscated or destroyed. It seeped into ears, into memory, into imagination. It was the sound of a new world knocking at the doors of an old one. That the radios themselves were miracles of engineering, humming with life even in the ruins of Japan's cities. To civilians who had known only the monotone broadcasts of the empire, the sight of American soldiers setting up loudspeakers and portable transmitters was like watching machines from the future unfold before their eyes. The hidden advantage was not only the music, it was the technology that carried it. For decades, Japan had invested in military hardware, planes, ships, and rifles. But the Americans had invested in communication. And in 1945, the ability to send sound anywhere, instantly, became as powerful as any weapon of war. The core of this advantage was the American Armed Forces radio service, powered by transmitters that dwarfed anything Japan could field. While Japanese sets often struggled with range, plagued by static and interference, American equipment operated with crystalline clarity. Their frequency modulation, FM, was revolutionary. Unlike the amplitude modulation systems used widely in Japan, FM cuts through the noise, unaffected by weather, distance, or enemy jamming. The SCR-299 mobile radio station, mounted on trucks, could broadcast music and news across vast swaths of land. Its signal so strong it seemed to erase silence itself. Civilians, peering cautiously from ruined windows, heard voices and music carried with a clarity they had never experienced before. It was as if the occupiers had brought the very air under their control. Specifications told a story as compelling as any battle. The American SCR-508 tank radio, weighing over 180 pounds, contained nearly 3,000 components, delivering a steady 25 watts of power. Its range extended several miles, linking tank crews seamlessly in the chaos of combat. German FUG-5 radios, by comparison, struggled with weak signals and interference. And while the Germans compensated with experience and doctrine, the Americans compensated with innovation. What Japanese civilians now witnessed in their streets was the peacetime extension of that same advantage: powerful radios, fed by generators and strung through city blocks, pushing swing music into every corner of occupied districts. Factories in Detroit and Chicago had made this possible, churning out radios and records by the millions. Motorola, RCA, and Western Electric supplied the backbone of America's sonic arsenal. While Japan had bled itself dry building aircraft that fell from the skies in flames, the United States had poured resources into the invisible battlefield of communication. By 1945, it could outproduce its enemies not only in tanks and planes, but also in songs and sound systems. To the civilians of Tokyo or Osaka, who had scavenged for months just to find batteries for their fragile radios, the sight of Americans powering entire neighborhoods with music was astonishing. Here was proof, in raw engineering, of a nation whose strength lay in abundance. Even the records themselves told a story of industrial might. Pressed in countless thousands back home, they were distributed freely to units overseas. Shellac discs spun on portable turntables, their grooves carrying the voices of Bing Crosby, Billie Holiday, and Glenn Miller. The turntables, ruggedized for field conditions, were slung into jeeps and mess halls alike. Soldiers could set them up in minutes, drop the needle, and flood the air with sound. Japanese civilians, watching from alleys, saw these devices as magical boxes, capable of producing entire orchestras from a spinning disc. For people who had lived under the rationing of every resource, the casual luxury of such technology was unfathomable. The technical depth of the American system was matched by its organization. The Armed Forces Radio Service was a logistical marvel, shipping thousands of records and tapes across the Pacific, ensuring that every garrison, no matter how remote, had the latest broadcasts. Programs like Command Performance and GI Jive were transmitted directly into occupied Japan, blending humor, news, and above all, music. To Japanese listeners, these broadcasts were unlike anything they had ever known. The voices were relaxed, playful, and unburdened by authority. Even before they understood the words, they understood the tone. It was a tone of abundance, confidence, and ease. German intelligence officers during the war had complained bitterly about this very phenomenon. Reports described American units coordinating with precision thanks to superior radios, striking with speed that seemed impossible. Now, in Japan, civilians were seeing the civilian side of the same advantage. It was not only about war fighting. It was about projecting power through sound. A single SCR 399 truck could power a block, filling ruined avenues with swing. A single transmitter could cover an entire district, drowning silence in music. The conquerors had weaponized joy, and the machinery that delivered it was as formidable as any bomber that had darkened Japan's skies. Inventors and engineers, many forgotten by history, played their part in this triumph. Edwin Armstrong, the father of FM radio, had fought bitter battles to prove the superiority of his system. By 1945, his work was vindicated on the largest stage imaginable. Motorola engineers refined rugged field radios that survived the mud of Normandy and the jungles of Leyte. RCA pressed endless records, its factories running day and night. Western Electric produced amplifiers so powerful they could carry sound across battlefields. Together, these industries formed a symphony of technology, culminating in the surreal moment when Japanese civilians, standing in rubble, heard Glenn Miller instead of gunfire. The scale was staggering. By the war's end, the United States had produced over 1 million field radios, tens of millions of records, and hundreds of thousands of amplifiers. This flood of technology ensured that when the occupation began, the Americans did not arrive with silence. They arrived with sound. Every jeep could carry music. Every garrison could broadcast. Every street could be filled with rhythm. For civilians, the realization was humbling. Japan had fought with courage, but it had fought in isolation. America had fought and connected, and now it occupied not only the land but the very air. The technical deep dive reveals the truth. The music was not an accident, nor a luxury. It was the product of engineering, logistics, and industrial scale unmatched by any other power. It was proof that victory was not only measured in destroyed cities or surrendered armies. It was measured in the ability to shape perception, to redefine silence, and to fill the void of defeat with the pulse of another culture. And in 1945, that pulse came from circuits, wires, amplifiers, and discs, the hidden arsenal that turned surrender into symphony. September 1945. The war was over. Yet in the streets of Yokohama, the first true clash of cultures began, not with rifles or bayonets, but with speakers mounted high on telephone poles and the crackling needle of a record player. American soldiers had hauled their equipment into the heart of the city, strung wires across bombed-out avenues, and set up loudspeakers that faced outward into neighborhoods still smoldering from firebombing raids. Civilians gathered cautiously, their faces drawn and gaunt, children clinging to the hems of their mothers' worn kimonos. They expected orders. They expected proclamations of dominance. Instead, what they heard was music, swing, bold and unrelenting. The first major battle of the occupation had begun, and its battlefield was the soundscape of Japan. The scene was surreal. American jeeps rumbled down streets where horse carts and bicycles were the last remaining vehicles of civilian life. Soldiers, relaxed and confident, carried portable radios that blared Glenn Miller's "In the Mood" into alleyways where silence had reigned for years. At first, the Japanese froze. For so long, noise had meant danger. The wail of sirens, the thunder off bombers, and the detonation of firebombs. Now the sound carried no warning, only rhythm. Yet suspicion remained. Families listened with narrowed eyes, wondering if the music masked some hidden announcement, some cruel jest at their expense. But as the trumpets climbed, as the drums pressed forward, the melody was undeniable. It was not a threat. It was a celebration. American soldiers observed the civilians with quiet satisfaction. This was not a random gesture. It was deliberate. Military planners knew that sound could be as powerful as sight. The first impression mattered. If the Japanese people were to accept occupation, they must not see only rifles and helmets. They must hear America's confidence. They must feel, in their very bones, the rhythm of a nation that had triumphed not only with bombs, but with culture. And so, the records spun, the amplifiers roared, and the streets of Yokohama became the stage for a new kind of battle. Reports from the time described the bewilderment vividly. A shopkeeper, his business reduced to rubble, leaned against a charred doorway and listened in silence. It was strange, he later recalled. We expected commands, but we heard songs. I did not understand the words, but I understood the feeling. They were not afraid. Children, braver than their elders, began to mimic the rhythm, stomping feet on broken pavement, clapping hands in ragged time. Mothers tried to hush them, fearing it might be disrespectful to the emperor, but the laughter of children was louder than caution. For the first time in years, the sound of joy returned to the streets in Tokyo. The experiment expanded. American engineers erected more powerful transmitters, pumping music across entire districts. By October, neighborhoods that had been reduced to rubble heard nightly broadcasts of the armed forces radio service. The program's mixed swing with commentary, a blend of confidence and levity that contrasted brutally with the solemnity of Japanese wartime broadcasts. Civilians who had once sat in darkness, whispering during air raids, now gathered by loudspeakers to listen. Some cried, others stood in silence. But all understood the same truth. A new era had begun, and its sound was foreign. The clash was not without resistance. Nationalist voices, though silenced politically, muttered in private that the music was humiliation. For them, hearing the enemy's songs in the very streets of the imperial capital was unbearable. Yet they were powerless. The occupation controlled the airwaves, and with control came inevitability. Even those who despised the sound could not stop listening. The melody wormed its way into memory, irresistible despite resentment. In one neighborhood, a group of young men attempted to drown out the broadcasts by singing old patriotic songs in unison. But the crowd that gathered around them soon drifted back toward the loudspeakers, drawn by the sheer force of the swing rhythm. The battle was decided without violence. The music had won. Perhaps the most decisive engagement came in Osaka, where American troops organized an open-air concert for both soldiers and civilians. The stage was little more than planks set over rubble, but when the band began to play, hundreds of Japanese gathered to watch. The soldiers, brass instruments gleaming under the fading sun, launched into a medley of American standards. At first, the crowd remained stiff, their faces blank masks of uncertainty. But as the music swelled, the atmosphere shifted. Children climbed onto the shoulders of parents, waving arms in imitation of the musicians. A young girl, no older than 6, began to spin in circles, her laughter piercing the somber air. The crowd, stunned, did not stop her. They watched, and some even smiled. That night, as the music echoed into the ruins, civilians whispered that perhaps peace had truly come. Losses in this battle were not measured in bodies, but in illusions. Japanese propaganda had insisted that Americans were cruel, godless beasts. Yet here they were, sharing music that made children laugh and elders weep. The shock of this realization rippled through neighborhoods. Some older men resisted, clinging to bitterness. But the younger generation was quicker to adapt. For them, the music was not humiliation, it was curiosity. They asked questions. Who made this sound? Where did it come from? Could they, too, learn to play it? Seeds were planted that would blossom years later in jazz clubs and dance halls across Tokyo. German officers, observing from afar, might have recognized the strategy. During the war, they had watched in frustration as American radios connected units with ease, while German units struggled in isolation. Now the same principle was applied to civilians. Where Japan had once controlled every voice, America unleashed thousands. Where silence had been enforced, sound was now abundant. It was not simply music. It was proof of control. The occupiers owned the air, and in doing so, they owned perception. By the winter of 1945, the battle for sound was decided. Japanese civilians no longer froze in confusion when the music began. They gathered, expectant. Some even began to hum along, their mouths forming words they did not yet understand. American soldiers noticed the shift and leaned into it, distributing records, staging more concerts, and opening dance halls where Japanese youth could watch or even join. The first major battle of the occupation had ended not with bloodshed, but with rhythm. The silence of defeat had been conquered by swing. And so, in the ruins of cities once consumed by fire, the strange sound of American music became the new anthem of survival. For the civilians who lived it, the memory was indelible. To hear trumpets where once there had been bombs was to witness the transformation of war into peace. The Americans had proven that victory could be declared not only with weapons, but also with song. The impact of that music went far beyond the novelty of hearing a foreign tune in a ruined street. It became a weapon of psychology, reshaping how a defeated nation perceived itself and its conquerors. For years, Japanese civilians had lived in a closed system of sound, state broadcasts, patriotic marches, military orders, and the endless roar of war machines. Now, in a matter of weeks, that soundscape was dismantled. In its place came American swing, blues, and ballads, filling the void left by defeat with rhythm and laughter. The effect was disorienting, humbling, and transformative. Strategically, the Americans understood what was unfolding. General MacArthur's staff recognized that the occupation could not succeed by force alone. To govern millions of civilians, demoralized yet proud, required more than guns. It required influence, subtle, constant, and undeniable. The broadcasts of music, the open-air concerts, and the dance halls set up in occupied cities were not accidents. They were deliberate tools of pacification. By flooding daily life with the sounds of abundance and confidence, the Americans created a psychological contrast so sharp that resistance seemed futile. Against hunger and silence, they set rhythm and energy. Against grief and solemnity, they set cheer. For civilians, the emotional toll was complex. Many wept upon hearing American songs, not because they understood the lyrics, but because the melodies carried a freedom that underscored their own loss. To hear a trumpet sing where one's home lay in ashes was both comforting and cruel. Comforting because it proved that joy still existed. Cruel because it highlighted the emptiness left behind. Yet in that contradiction lay transformation. The people began to see their conquerors not only as enemies, but also as emissaries of a world they had been denied. A world of plenty. A world where sound itself was limitless. The psychological divide between conqueror and conquered was stark. American soldiers, young and brimming with confidence, played records casually, as though victory had been easy. They laughed, they danced, they lived without fear. For Japanese civilians, the sight was stunning. Here were men who had crossed the ocean, toppled an empire, and now filled its ruins with joy. To see such vitality was to understand the scale of defeat, not just military, but cultural. Japan had built a war machine of steel and sacrifice, but America had built a society that could produce both bombers and Bing Crosby, both tanks and trumpets. It was a reminder that the war had been lost long before the surrender. The seeds of defeat were sown in the very fabric of culture. Reports from occupation authorities noted this shift in morale. Civilians who had once avoided American patrols now lingered nearby, drawn by the sound of music. Children followed soldiers, imitating their movements, giggling at the strange words of the songs. Parents, though cautious, allowed it, recognizing that their children were hearing the future. The music softened fear. It transformed the occupier from a faceless enemy into something almost human. And though pride resisted, the heart yielded. In the streets of Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima, the sound of swing became the sound of inevitability. America was here, and it would not be ignored. German veterans of the war might have understood the same phenomenon in reverse. On the Eastern Front, they had fought against silence, isolation, and broken communication. American forces, by contrast, had thrived on connection, with radios linking every tank, every squad, and every aircraft. The same advantage now defined the occupation. Where Japanese families once felt isolated, they were now linked, whether they wished it or not, by the constant hum of American music. It was inescapable, and in its inescapability lay its power. The psychological impact was total. Surrender was no longer abstract. It was lived daily through every note that spilled into ruined neighborhoods. The emotional toll on former soldiers was perhaps the most severe. Men who had returned from the front, broken and ashamed, listened with clenched fists as American songs filled their streets. To them, the music was not only foreign. It was a reminder of loss. They had been taught that honor meant silence, stoicism, and sacrifice. The Americans flaunted the opposite: abundance, vitality, and improvisation. The contrast was unbearable. Some cursed under their breath. Others retreated indoors. But even they could not block it out. The music seeped through thin walls, through shattered windows, and through every crack in the ruins. It was relentless, just as American bombers had been relentless. But now the payload did not fire. It was rhythm. For younger Japanese, the impact was different. They embraced the sound, tentatively at first, then boldly. What their parents saw as humiliation, they saw as opportunity. Dance halls opened in Tokyo, where American soldiers and Japanese civilians mingled cautiously. Youth watched the moves of the GIs, copied their steps, and began to make the rhythms their own. Within months, small jazz clubs began to appear, playing both American records and Japanese imitations. The psychological toll on the older generation was mirrored by the awakening of the younger. Where silence had been imposed, sound now offered escape. Where conformity had been demanded, improvisation now beckoned. Strategically, the advantage was immense. A population divided between grief and fascination was far easier to govern than one united in resistance. The music disarmed, not by force, but by seduction. Civilians who might have resented the occupation instead found themselves humming along to foreign tunes, their anger diluted by rhythm. By the end of 1946, reports noted a marked decline in organized hostility. Resistance had not vanished, but it had withered. The Americans had done more than disarm Japan's military. They had infiltrated its soul. The lesson was clear. In modern war, psychological dominance mattered as much as firepower. America had demonstrated this not only on the battlefield but also in the aftermath. The swing of a saxophone was as potent as the roar of a bomber. The laughter of soldiers sharing music was as powerful as the march of tanks. Civilians understood, consciously or not, that the war had been lost not only in Okinawa or Hiroshima, but in the ability of one nation to create abundance while another demanded sacrifice. The music was proof, undeniable and unrelenting, of which vision of the world had prevailed, and so the psychological impact deepened with each passing day. Where once Japanese civilians had looked upon their conquerors with fear, they now looked upon them with awe, resentment, and reluctant admiration. The sound of swing became the sound of surrender, not imposed, but absorbed. It was not a rifle pointed at the chest. It was a melody lodged in the mind. And for a nation rebuilding from ruins, that melody would prove impossible to forget. In the months that followed, the music became more than background noise. It became the pulse of a new Japan. The legacy of those first broadcasts, of those first open-air concerts, stretched far beyond the surrender. They marked the beginning of a transformation that reshaped not only Japanese society but also the very trajectory of the modern world. Swing and jazz, once symbols of the conqueror, evolved into bridges between cultures. American music, carried on records and radios, became the soundtrack of occupation, then of reconstruction, and finally of rebirth. Civilians who had once stood in rubble, bewildered by the strange rhythms, soon found themselves seeking out the songs. By 1947, Japanese bands had begun to form, imitating the styles of Glenn Miller, Duke Ellington, and Benny Goodman. Dance halls flourished in Tokyo and Osaka, where youth, hungry for escape from grief, embraced the freedom of jazz. What had begun as a shock soon became aspiration. For a younger generation, the music represented possibility, the chance to step beyond the silence of the past and into the vitality of the future. It was no longer just a foreign sound. It was a language they, too, could learn to speak. The occupation authorities encouraged this transformation. They understood that music was more than entertainment. It was influence. Programs like GI Jive and Command Performance continued to broadcast, introducing Japanese listeners not only to American songs but also to the humor, ease, and confidence of a democratic culture. The rigid hierarchies of wartime life began to erode as civilians embraced the improvisation and individuality embedded in jazz. The occupiers had done more than disarm Japan's armies. They had dismantled its soundscape and rebuilt it in their own image. The legacy of this cultural invasion rippled outward. In the 1950s, Japan emerged as one of the great centers of jazz outside America, its clubs attracting both local talent and touring legends. The very music that had once stunned civilians into silence became a badge of modernity, of participation in a global culture. It was no longer a reminder of defeat, but of resilience. Japan had taken the sound of the conqueror and made it its own. In smoky clubs from Ginza to Kobe, the saxophone solos and syncopated rhythms testified to a nation that had endured destruction and yet found rebirth in the very sound of its occupier. Strategically, the lesson was not lost on the world. Military theorists studying the occupation recognized that America's true strength had been not only in its bombs and tanks, but also in its ability to project culture as power. German generals, writing their post-war reflections, acknowledged that America had fought as a connected nation, its soldiers united by radios and morale sustained by music. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel is said to have remarked that while Germany built better tanks, America built soldiers who fought together. The same was true in occupation. While Japan had built walls of silence, America built bridges of sound. This legacy carried into the Cold War. Psychological warfare became a cornerstone of modern strategy. The Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and countless other broadcasts followed the model tested in Japan, using music and culture as weapons to erode enemy morale and inspire civilian populations. Swing gave way to rock and roll, then to pop, each wave of sound carrying with it the values of freedom, abundance, and connection. What began in the ruins of Tokyo became a blueprint for the information battles of the 20th century. For Japan itself, the transformation was profound. A society once bound to obedience and uniformity became one of the world's centers of cultural fusion. By the 1960s, Japanese jazz musicians stood alongside their American counterparts, not as imitators, but as innovators. The children who had once danced cautiously in ruined streets to foreign swing grew into adults who filled concert halls with their own rhythms. The legacy of surrender had been rewritten, not as silence, but as song. The emotional impact endured. Survivors of the occupation would later recall the shock of hearing American music in the streets with vivid clarity. For some, it was humiliation. For others, relief. But for nearly all, it was unforgettable. The moment the silence of defeat was broken by a trumpet or a saxophone marked a turning point not only in the war's aftermath but also in their own lives. It was the sound of an ending and, simultaneously, the sound of a beginning. In a broader sense, the lesson was universal. Wars are fought with steel and fire, but peace is forged in subtler ways. America's victory in World War II was not only measured in the ruins of enemy cities, but also in the rhythms that filled those ruins afterward. The occupiers brought not only dominance but also connection, not only command but also communication. And in doing so, they revealed a truth that would echo across generations. In modern conflict, culture can conquer where weapons cannot. As decades passed, the memory of that strange, shocking moment remained. A memory of civilians standing in rubble, listening to the music of their enemy. Unable to look away, unable to shut their ears. The streets of Japan, once filled with the march of soldiers and the cries of air raid sirens, had become filled with swing. From that collision was born a new era, one defined not by silence, but by sound. And so the story closes with a final truth. Firepower wins battles. Strategy wins wars. But it is connection, the invisible threads of music, communication, and culture, that wins peace. In 1945, the Japanese civilians could not believe what they were hearing. The enemy's music filling their broken streets. Yet in that disbelief was the seed of transformation. For in modern war, melody can be as decisive as metal, and rhythm can outlast ruin.